Hello, and welcome to the Good Governance Institute Public Good podcast. Today, we will be discussing the Nolan Principle of Openness. The Nolan Principle of Openness require holders of public office to act and take decisions in an open and transparent manner. It also stipulates that information should not be withheld from the public unless there are clear and lawful reasons to do so. Here to help me with this discussion is my colleague David Cryer, Principal Consultant at the Good Governance Institute, leading our Sustainable Financial Governance offer, and our distinguished guest, Baroness Helena Kennedy KC. Among her many honors and distinctions, she very kindly accepted the 2022 Good Governance Award for being a champion of human rights and for detailing how the British legal system was biased against women. I am Jaco Marais, and I think you'll want to listen to this. For something to be open, it needs to be understandable by the public. How are the public being bamboozled?
This morning, when I had a sift of the newspapers, there's a story here this morning about huge amounts of money that local authorities are having to pay the private owners of care homes for very poor quality offerings, which are available then to the ordinary people in our society who aren't able to pay the £8,000 a month to be in a kind of very decent care home. So there are categories of care homes, and the care homes that are being provided by local authorities aren't owned by the local authorities. They're actually owned by private individuals or companies or offshore companies. And the billions of pounds that are being paid are taxpayers' money that are actually going into the pockets of people who aren't even themselves paying tax into this country. There's something that is corrupt and terrible about that. And you know, I'm reading it this morning. Did one know? No, of course one didn't know, because somewhere in the figures, you never told the true story. We have had the same thing in relation to, for example, the care of children. In our society, we take children into care. Sometimes it's because there's ill health in the family. There may have been a mental breakdown by the primary care parent, maybe the mother. I think maybe that the family is completely dysfunctional and that parents have parted and the child can't be cared for. It may be that the child is showing signs of having serious problems themselves. And so the state has a responsibility on our behalf to take care of those, particularly the young. And what we're hearing about is that was put into private hands too. It used to be that it was very much the responsibility of local authorities and of basically arms of the state who are representing us, trying to create a caring society. And those children are then put into places totally unsuitable, frequently with very little oversight, none of the sort of caring that one would expect of the government parent to be putting into place. And we're finding out that huge amounts of profit are being made by, again, private companies that have taken over these care homes. And instead of it being the responsibility of a caring state, a government taking on that responsibility on our behalf, we're finding that is outsourced and that profitability is the major driver. Now, did we all know that until it was reported upon last year by investigative journalism? I mean, there's something wrong in our society when it takes investigative reporting to disclose actually where our own taxpayers' money is going in relation to this ideological commitment to outsource everything. There's some moral things in our midst which I think deserve and demand proper openness so that we can see where public money is going and whether it is reaching the standards and moral standards that I think are expected of a proper caring state.
David, do you have any examples of things that we might think are happening in the NHS but are actually very different than they should be?
It's a struggle everywhere in the NHS at the moment, not just because of finances, but because the inability to recruit staff. And, we deal with lots of NHS organisations all across the country. And and the themes are really depressingly consistent. I mean, there is perhaps a degree of honesty and openness and transparency, I'm not sure the right word, but within the NHS or politically and around the NHS to develop a sustainable model. We don't have a sustainable healthcare system, and I think that's a lack of honesty and openness from politicians. We seem to lurch from either being, brief periods of being well funded and having, frankly, a reasonably good 21st century healthcare, Western healthcare system, to quite long periods of frankly decline, and generally receiving fantastic care, but in an extraordinarily stretched environment. And if you throw strikes into that, it just creates almost a perfect storm, really. But I think that the state of the health service is commonly understood. What isn't really talked about, and I think this is a reflection of our political discourse at the moment, the challenge in how we improve things. We do have a very adversarial political system which somehow ameliorates or removes the ability to have intellectual thought about how do we collectively solve problems. There are all sorts of areas where that's a problem in taxation policy, in health policy, in all sorts of areas. I think we understand publicly what's happening in the NHS. I think we don't collectively have a conversation about how do we improve the situation. It ends up as a political football with a price tag on it, and I think it's much more sophisticated. And as a public, we could absolutely engage in that discussion. I think that's where we drop short and let ourselves down really collectively in how we improve things.
How do we take the politics out of these debates and still be open and transparent with the public?
Before we go there, I do think that we've injured many areas of our public service by the introduction of the language of commerce. And so, the very fact that we're talking about doctors and nurses as units of productivity is disgusting. That's not why they're there. We can be business-like without turning things into businesses. And it's a mistake that has been made over the whole last, I would say, probably 40 years. I mean, the business it started, of course, with the shift that took place with Thatcherism. Is the public sector doing far too much? Now, I would agree that there are certain things that the state shouldn't be doing. But I also think that we have privatized too many of the things where outsourcing and so on is not the appropriate way. And I mentioned some of them earlier, the business of care. The care of our elderly who are not well off. I mean, obviously, if people are rich, they can send their children to Eton. I have no objection to them doing it. They get that. That's fine. But, rich people can buy themselves places in the most fancy of care homes so that it's like they're living at the Ritz. Good luck to them. But for the majority of people, that's not possible. And when it comes particularly to care, I don't believe that you should be, shrinking away from the responsibilities that we have as a society.
Would it be worth considering the difference between government and governance, and when one starts and the other stops?
If you think about that, the governance of an institution is within an environment, within a context that is set for it. I was thinking about banks. We just had another potential banking problems. We inevitably blame regulation for the banks. What's the board doing? Why isn't the board being held accountable? So, we went through a banking crisis which crashed the economy, caused all sorts of problems. How many of those boards were genuinely held to account, paid the price for the damage, the huge damage that was caused to people's lives, to the economy? And we don't take this governance role as seriously as we should do. And it's a very complex role. It's a very difficult job to sit on a board. I don't underestimate the challenges, but that is what they're being paid for. And certainly in the private sector can be paid very significant sums of money. And the situation of that bank in California, it was banking 101. It was misaligning the deposits against the the lending. I mean, I could work out that was not sustainable. And they were doing it, as Helena was saying earlier about cares, to maximize profit in the short term, knowing that the downside was only they'll walk away and try it somewhere else. And I think that gets really dangerous.
To do that thing of looking at the difference between governance and government, governments should be involved in good governance, just like anybody who has particularly a fiduciary duty, a duty to look after monies. And so, for example, even if you're a charity, and you're not being paid to be on a board, I think people often enter into these things out of goodwill, but they're not adequately informed of what comes with the role of being on a board or an executive committee, for example, of a membership organization, where monies are paid by members into trade unions or into other kinds of membership organizations, and that the executive committee, the board, have responsibilities to make sure that those monies are well spent in appropriate ways, and that there should be openness about how the money is spent. And I think that in lots of organizations, that's not the case. I just had played a role in an inquiry into some bad behavior inside a trade union. But what came through was not just that there was bad behavior inside, the sort of machinery of running of the union, but also that there was very poor governance. That there was an executive committee, but they were kept rather kind of informed in a very limited way, and that's a classic thing that happens inside bodies. That even on the boards of companies, that and people are very happy to be there because they're paid. The House of Lords is full of people who sit on boards of companies, and they're paid a significant sum of money. And if you can collect a whole set of boards, you can be doing pretty well for yourself. Now, you're setting the board papers. Does everybody read all the board papers? Do they really examine them for what's not being told to you, but what might be underneath that? There's a great saying, and I don't want to be vulgar on your podcast, but there's a saying about all of this, which is that the board basically should be treated like mushrooms, that you keep them in the dark and you feed them manure, basically. And that happens in lots of places where you carefully manipulate the telling of the story that goes to the board. And so half the time the board isn't, and they're not asking the right questions, because they're not mindful of the fact that they have a duty beyond sitting around there with a crowd of people who they've become sort of friends with. And so the chief executive and the chairman can often manipulate all of that in order to give the board the information. And so a board should be actually full of people on their mettle, knowing that that's what goes on, but it isn't what goes on. And so good governance is about people taking on those duties in a very inquisitive and inquiring way in order to get to the real facts. Now, there's a problem for me in all of this, in the business of governance, which is that, unfortunately, more and more folk, after they do their initial degree, go off to business school. Maybe David's been to one. Did you go to business school, David? Yes, I guessed it. Anyway.
I did, I'm afraid.
You do? Did you do it, Jaco?
I did go to business school, yes.
Yeah, well, one of the things a business school is, and it's the mantra that came out of the Harvard Business School tradition, which is your primary concern. I mean, the major interest of any company and your role as the chief executive or a senior executive is to maximize shareholder value. And so that becomes the priority, to get as much money in, to give it out in the form of shares. And I think that in a decent society, which is well governed, where good governance matters, there should be responsibility to more than the shareholder. And so I was always very interested in a much wider conception of what the role of any of these bodies, whether it's a charity, whether it's a not-for-profit thing, any of these things, it should always be about who are our stakeholders, and inevitably, it's the wider community. You don't have workers in a business unless people are well educated. And you need, even for the lower level jobs, you need people to be literate. You need people to So that has to inevitably come out of public funding. If you want people to work for you, with skills, you have to invest in a machinery that creates skills and skilled people. If you want to have a national health service, then you have to, because if you have a heart attack on the street, whether you're rich or poor, you're likely to be taken to the emergency room, to the A&E. You want good people there to meet you at the door to identify immediately what's happened to you, And it's just crazy for us to want to turn our nation into a place in which we aren't carefully calibrating how good governance works in every aspect of our lives, whether it's in school boards, whether it's in hospital boards and trusts, in all of those areas. And I'm afraid that old secret of keep them in the dark has been the way of things. Now, the other problem we've got in Britain is that Britain is particularly secretive. And it's been one of the things about the British state that we passed around the colonies and so on, which was tell people as little as, tell them only what they really need to know. And it was a paternalistic thing, which is don't tell people things that are going to make them panic, which would make them, and that they're not smart enough to fully understand, keep them in the dark about it. And that's one of the concerns that I have about the way in which we do business and we do government in this country.
Well, these are absolutely the values of the Good Governance Institute that were really born from Nelson Mandela, who employed Judge Mervyn King to launch the King Committee, where they looked at capitalism not just being for shareholders, but they wanted to invent a new form of capitalism for a new South Africa that created value for the community. And they did this through integrated reporting, which reported on the impact an organization has, not just the shareholder profits. And that's how good governance was born, corporate social responsibility. And Judge Mervyn King is still involved with the Good Governance Institute and frequently speaks to different topics. Now, talking about the public and being kept in the dark and being fed manure, shall we comment on the ongoing Partygate inquiry, for example? Because I think there's quite a few Nolan principles that come to mind, particularly one we want to add to the list, which is a fairness. It just feels very unfair, and it's a real visceral example of not being open and transparent.
Boris Johnson's position is that we know that there were social gatherings and so on went on inside Downing Street. We don't have to revisit that. The question is, what did he come to Parliament and say? And he came to Parliament and said, we absolutely abided by all the rules and so on. And you'd have to be a fool to think that was it totally unintentional? I happen to think that you have to deal with the man that's before you. I'm a person who spent my life in the courts, and I've represented people who will look you in the eye and say, I didn't do it. But all the evidence points in the direction that they did do it. And so he has convinced himself that he really was just, being a decent guy, and he wanted to say farewell to people, and there was no malintent. We know things about Boris Johnson, but people making judgments like that learn, as our judges do, that you have to learn something about leaving to one side any gut feeling you might have and saying, where does the evidence take us here? Is it of the high enough standard? Does it reach the thresholds that are necessary? Now, I think that in the modern world, the idea that, it has to be proof beyond reasonable doubt for a prime minister. Can we prove beyond reasonable doubt that he went in there and that he was not being truthful? I think that's too high a bar for the circumstances we're in.
Judge, I think it's pretty clear that the individual shouldn't be in Parliament. He should never be Prime Minister. And I don't underestimate, I think that the damage he's personally caused to the country is enormous in economic terms, in political terms, through Brexit, through all sorts of things. I think the damage is huge, and my children will Suffolk. No, it does seem that he's being held to account. He was in front of a public committee of peers of other MPs, and the House who referred him to that committee is going to make a judgment. And as you say, I think the evidence does seem to speak for itself. I mean, the context that was going on, the tragic consequences of so much of what happens during that period, it does look as if he is going to have to pay the consequences. And I think it would be good if there was a by-election. It should be thrown out on his ear. That feels like the right thing to do. And it looks as if the system is saying that's unacceptable, that kind of behaviour. We are going to treat that in what seems to me like an appropriate way. So I think for some people that will be slightly cathartic to see that happen.
There is undoubtedly moral damage, and the psychological effects of continually seeing cover-ups that are later revealed to be untrue is really real for people. And I know a lot of people that have switched off the news because they just cannot within themselves handle it and continue with their lives in a productive way. Is the lack of openness damaging public confidence in our democracy as a whole?
Here were people whose families were dying. My daughter was on the COVID wards in a London hospital as a young doctor, and she was having to hold up iPads to people to say, your dad's now on a ventilator and he'll be in a coma, and so we just want you to know this. And so they hold up the thing, and people would say, Dad, I haven't told you enough how much I love you. And you know, when you get in, I don't feel that I understood when you get into the ambulance that was how serious it was. And I just went, and the horror of being separated and then never being able to go in there. And so if you were to ask the doctors who dealt with all of that, and the people's loss and the separation and the deprivation that they experienced, and to find out at the same time in Downing Street they were having parties, I'm afraid that you, as the boss person, didn't bother to make sure that you knew exactly what was going on. I think that is going to be a hard one to judge. I mean, and I think that you have to say, was he reckless? Was he reckless about the information he was giving to Parliament? And I, you know, certainly as somebody on the outside watching it, I think that I have great trust that this committee will do the right thing. Whether you create a situation where you have to have a by-election and so on, I don't know. But I do think that what we're seeing is, I think, an example of fairly good due process. These things are hard, and due process has to operate inside workplaces when there are people make complaints against their superiors and so on. Explaining the nature of due process is difficult sometimes, but it has to be about fairness. People have to feel that they were listened to, that they were heard. And there's an awful lot of people who will be watching that thinking a different set of rules operated for some people than the ones that operated for the majority.
I'm one of those people that Jaco referred to that doesn't watch the news anymore because I'm liable to throw something at the TV. I get so angry. But why do our politicians get away with this appalling language with migration? When any young person I talk to finds it abhorrent that you'd have that kind of approach. Why aren't they revolting? I'm not sure why. It might help if they did, I think.
As a country, we want to be seen as a fair country. I think that's absolutely how we pride ourselves, but it's not bearing out in the facts. Should we add fairness to the list of Nolan Principles? Would that help?
I certainly think that it was very interesting. When the Millennium Dome was created, we were stepping into a new millennium. And the Millennium Dome was created as to be a great sort of festival of this moment. And there was to be in it, a sort of one aspect of it was a celebration of the great things about Britain. And they, teams of people put their heads together to try and decide what the great things of Britain were. our cultural product. We're great at filmmaking, we're great at theatre, we're great at music, we're great at all manner of things. And we think of, all those things, which we don't really invest in very much either. There's the BBC closing down its, choirs and things like that, and having to rethink it because of public outrage. The BBC, one of its great things, and yet it's being attacked all the time. One of the things that Britain very proudly exhibited as being one of its things was actually fairness. They spoke about the whole business of, the rule of law. Our we looked to as not just the mother of parliaments, what a great place we were deemed to be, and we boasted our position on fairness, due process, the rule of law, Britain as the home of justice. And I'm afraid that we're tearing that up because of the ways in which we are dismissing our commitments that we made into international conventions. But even talking about every turn, just ignoring decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. We wrote the European Convention on Human Rights. It was the British lawyers. There's something going on here. And I think that we're seeing a degrading of the things that made us as a nation stand out in the world. We may have been small. There we were at the, in the Security Council of the United Nations. We may be small, but there we were, signing up to the International Criminal Court. We don't even have a judge now on the International Court of Justice. And do you know why? Because all the European countries didn't vote for us after Brexit. All our ex-colonies are pretty pissed off with us for many other things that we've failed to do there. Many of the countries that were related to us, and where the Queen was the head of their state, they're now saying, well, she was a wonderful woman. We wouldn't have wanted to do that to her while she was alive, but now we're wanting our separateness. Now, we've got to reckon with what's happening and what we should be standing for, our values. And I'm afraid we are diminishing the commitment that we had to those values.
How do we turn that round? What changes that? Because I think if you did that exercise now that we did at the millennium to think what are the great things about Britain that we want to celebrate, it would be a much shorter list, wouldn't it? For all the reasons that you say.
It sure would be.
Yeah.
You look. We're talking here about the Nolan Principle of openness and transparency. There are some aspects of what goes on in our society that are in a darker corner of our world. If people have no cause to ever think twice about what happens in the justice system, then it's not an area where they're going to get exercised about deprivation. When it came to the business of, you have to remember that you mentioned, David, the full horror of 2007, the banking crisis, which was a global crisis. And I'm not doing a party pre-thing here, but there was a kind of lie told then, which was that it was all down to the fact that Labour had mismanaged the economy. Under Labour, an awful lot of good things happened in the health service and in schools for our children and so on. But let's for a moment just turn to the business of that economic crisis, because it was faced in many places. One of the things that was done at that time here in Britain, more than anywhere else, was austerity. We introduced policies of austerity that were so biting. Now, the real purpose of that was an agenda which was to shrink the state. That, we had this welfare state, it'd been a cushion and so on, shrink it. This is our opportunity to really shrink it down to the bones. And as a result, we've ended up with, for example, let's just deal with my area. Justice took a hit of 40%. Just think about that. It was one of the biggest, I think it was the biggest hit of any government department, any ministry. And it meant that the probation service was privatized, right? And it's now recognized it was a disaster, a total disaster. And so, of course, if you haven't got you can't talk about alternatives to prison haven't got a probation service to run alternatives. You can't talk about dealing with people on parole and stopping them reoffending, rehabilitating people if you don't have a good probation, well-trained, highly, developed probation systems. I'm just telling you, we destroyed something that was wonderful in this country. We took money out of all those things like youth work in our communities. Then they complain about crime. We have a backlog. We limited the number of courts, and therefore the number of sitting hours that judges could do because there are so few of them. We sold the courts off to be made into flats. So people were making money out of it like bandits. A backlog of 56,000 cases at the moment. Right? Think about that. Think about the victims who are not seeing justice in that. I mean, it's a scandal. But of course, for most people, they don't see it. And it's an invisible part. It's one of those bits of our system that is fundamental, but is almost invisible. And so is it any wonder that women are outraged about the failure of the justice system for them? And the failure and policing, of course, also was cut to the bone. Is it any wonder that people of colour, minority, gay people, so many people feel the system just doesn't work for them? Because when they are wronged, our social contract is bring me your wrongs. Bring them to us. Don't go off and sort it out yourself and punch the lights out of somebody that's done something that you don't like or that is a harm to you. That adds to it, the justice system. And then the justice system's in this state, and yet it's invisible. So, I mean, I feel that if you were talking about transparency and openness, I mean, the stories that can be told about the full horror of that. But we have also into this, I'm sorry you're getting my full blast here. One of the things that we've done is we've deprofessionalized the professions. We're in the process, in this great neoliberal experiment that we've been engaged in. We have said the real thing to do is become a banker. I was the head of an Oxford college for a while, and I had young people who were doing their degrees in physics, engineering, material science. Brilliant young people. They were all headhunted to go into the city to become bankers because they understood algorithms. And so they didn't become the producers of new ideas and new things. No, they were in there in the banking system because they were earning so much money. And of course now education has become something that makes people indebted. They've got debt. So who wouldn't want to earn a lot of money and earn at the drop of a hat over £100,000 for your first job, when young doctors earn a quarter of that if they're lucky? It's just, and so we've deprofessionalized our professions. You only have to talk to young lawyers who work in the public sector. There's no legal aid for immigration now. There's no legal aid. The expertise is disappearing. So I'm afraid that I feel that we're in an even graver mess, David, than you described earlier on. We are in a serious, serious mess in this country. I pity any government that comes in to replace what we've got just now, because I just don't know where to start.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? And frankly, rather depressing. So on a personal level, I'm involved in an employment tribunal. It's taken 2.5 years from the situation that with a thing that happened to an appearance in an employment tribunal. 2.5 years. I barely remember the details of what happened. I'm going to be examined about the details. I think that's an appalling situation, really.
And there are people waiting for criminal cases to be out, and the date that they've been given already is 3 years ahead.
Yeah. Well, that's not justice being done, is it? That is justice being delayed. I wonder why you look at what's going on in France, and they're trying to change pension rules by a relatively small amount, not as much as over here, and people are rioting, and the response from the public is interesting, and yet the public here seem to put up with things. Why aren't our young people out there? Where are the university students getting angry and organising votes and organising a political response? Why? I don't quite understand why.
It's heartrending, actually. And I do think there are a number of things that have come together here, which has been lowering the if you like, the kind of, I mean, I'm so interested, Jaco, that you used that term of moral damage. I think that, for example, inside the Home Office just now, one of the things that I've discovered by sitting on a select committee that was about home affairs and justice, we had evidence being given to us. One of the problems inside the Home Office is the turnover of staffing. It's a churn. And so the people who are having to do these cases about, this is here's Tariq Ahmed from somewhere who's applying for asylum. And they're doing his case, and in it he describes the horrible things that he experienced in Syria or wherever. And first of all, it's eating away at their own souls reading about this stuff. But also the culture inside is to be saying no. And so the moral damage to people is very real. And I think it's what leads to this churn. People can't live with themselves because of what it is they're being expected to do. And also, of course, they're paid poor money. And that's why you're having civil servants going on strike as well. All these areas which is the stuff that is the mortar, that holds everything together. They've picked away at that mortar. And so now the whole edifice is shaking. And there's a sort of carelessness about not going into the detail. It's the Boris Johnson way of doing government. And it's certainly not about good governance.
So I'm very interested to hear what our listeners have thought about today's podcast. But what I think, what I've learned was that we should never stop fighting for fairness and openness. And we should, as the public, fight for our right to party. So thank you very much to my guests, David Cryer, Principal Consultant at the Good Governance Institute, and Baroness Helena Kennedy KC. Thank you very much for joining us today.